In the spring of 33 AD, on a hill outside the walls of Jerusalem called Golgotha, the place of the skull, a Roman execution was already 3 hours old. The crowd had thinned. The soldiers played dice in the dust, their tunics darkened at the back with sweat. The sky, which had been sharp and pale at dawn, was beginning to change color in a way nobody standing there could yet explain. 3 crosses stood against that sky. Most people had stopped looking at them. One woman had not stopped. She had not moved. She had not looked away. She was standing close enough to see the sweat tracking through the dust on his face, close enough to hear the labor of his breathing. Each exhale a small, effortful thing. And she had been standing there since the 9th hour of the morning, when the nails went in and the cross went up and the world she had built, around 33 years of watching him became the world she would have to survive without him. Her name was Mary, and what happened inside her during those 6 hours is one of the most restrained silences in all of Scripture, and one of the most instructive. Stay with this one to the end. Every detail placed here is placed for a reason. Picture her first, not as a painting. Not the serene Madonna of Italian frescoes, eyes lifted, hands folded in composed grief. That image was made by people who had never buried a child. Forget it. What the historical record gives us is something far more difficult and far more human. Mary, in the spring of 33 AD, was somewhere between 45 and 50 years old, depending on which scholars you follow on the question of her age at the Annunciation. She had walked, according to Luke 23, with a group that followed Jesus from the Praetorium through the city streets to the hill. That walk was approximately half a mile on uneven stone, through a crowd that was not quiet. She arrived at Golgotha on foot, standing, not carried, not supported by a chair or a seat, standing. And John chapter 19 verse 25 uses a specific Greek word for her position at the cross, peristemi, which means to stand beside, to remain present, to not withdraw. John's choice of that word was not accidental. It meant something to him to record that she did not collapse and that she did not leave. The first hour was the worst for sound. Crucifixion crowds in first-century Jerusalem were not silent vigils. Roman executions were public spectacle by design. They were meant to communicate power through humiliation, and the crowd participated. Matthew 27 records the passers-by shaking their heads and calling out mockery. The chief priests and scribes called out. Even, Matthew notes with painful precision, the men crucified beside him joined in at first. Mary heard all of it. She could not unhear it. She had heard his voice since before he drew his first breath, had known the register of it when he laughed, when he was tired, when he taught in the synagogue at Nazareth, when he called her name across a courtyard in the early morning before the rest of the house stirred. And now she was hearing strangers use that voice as a target, hurling words at it the way children hurl stones at something they cannot understand. There is no scripture that records what her face did in that first hour. The silence of the text is its own kind of testimony. The third hour brought the darkness. Luke 23 verse 44 records it plainly. There was darkness over the whole land from the 6th hour to the 9th hour. Midday, and the light failed. The scholars debate the cause: solar eclipse, Khamsin dust, some atmospheric event the text does not explain. But what is not debated is the effect on the people standing there. The soldiers, who had seen executions before, grew quiet. The crowd thinned faster. People who had come to watch decided, in the gathering dark at noon, that they did not want to be there anymore. Mary stayed. She stood in the dark on a hill outside a city that had condemned her son, and she stayed. She had stayed in harder places than this. She had stayed in a stable in Bethlehem when there was no room. She had stayed in Egypt as a refugee, grinding grain in a borrowed courtyard, far from every face she knew. She had stayed in Nazareth while the village murmured about the circumstances of her eldest son's birth. Staying was not something she learned on that hill. It was something she had been practicing for 33 years. What she felt? This is the place where we must be honest about what the record gives us and what it does not. Scripture does not give us Mary's inner monologue. There is no gospel passage where she describes her own grief. What we have is the prophecy of Simeon, recorded in Luke 2, verse 35, delivered when Jesus was 40 days old, and Mary had carried him to the temple for the purification rite. Simeon looked at the infant in her arms and said, "A sword will pierce your own soul too." She had been carrying that sentence for 33 years. She had folded it into her daily life the way you fold a letter you cannot bring yourself to throw away, present always, not always in view. And now the sword was not a prophecy. It was the weight of what she was watching. It was the sound of his breathing growing shorter between each exhale. It was the knowledge which no other person standing on that hill possessed in the way she possessed it, of every breath he had ever taken before this one. John records a moment, the only spoken exchange between them at the cross, in John 19 verses 26 and 27. Jesus looked down from the cross and saw his mother, and saw the disciple, whom he loved, standing beside her. And he said to her, "Woman, behold your son." And to the disciple, "Behold your mother." Scholars of first-century Jewish culture note that the address, woman, was not cold or distancing in the way it sounds to a modern ear. It was a formal address, a term of honor. He was, in the middle of his own dying, making provision for her. He was, with what breath remained to him, ensuring that she would not be alone. The hands that had once reached up for her, from a sleeping mat in a house in Nazareth, were now nailed above her head, and he was still trying to take care of her. She did not speak in return. John does not record a word from her, only that she received it. Only that she stood there and received it. The 9th hour, the hour of his death, is recorded in all 4 Gospels with unusual unanimity. He cried out, the veil of the temple tore, the earth shook. And a Roman centurion, a man who had supervised crucifixions as a professional matter, looked at what had just happened and said, according to Mark 15, verse 39, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." That centurion was a secondary witness, a man with no stake in the theological question, no reason to say what he said, except that something had happened in front of him that his professional experience could not contain. He was not a follower. He was not a believer. He was the man holding the execution order, and he looked at the woman who had been standing at the foot of that cross for 6 hours, and at the man who had just died on it, and he said what he saw. That testimony has survived 2,000 years because John and Mark both thought it mattered enough to record. It mattered because it came from outside the circle of faith. It came from the empire that had just carried out the killing. Mary received her son's body. John 19 records that Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus came with linen and spices, 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes, and that the body was wrapped and placed in a new tomb in a garden nearby. The Gospels do not record Mary's actions in those minutes, but what Jewish burial practice in the first century required was that the women of the family be present for the preparation of the body. She would have been there. She would have touched the wounds. She would have smoothed the linen over his shoulders with the same hands that had swaddled him in Bethlehem, pressing the cloth flat, folding the edges under with the quiet precision of a woman who had learned long ago that love, when it has nowhere left to go, finds its way into small, careful gestures. And then the stone was rolled across the entrance, and it was finished, and she walked back through a city that was quieting down for Sabbath, carrying 33 years of his life in a body that had no idea yet what Sunday would bring. The sword Simeon promised had landed. It had done what swords do, and she was still standing. What the 6 hours at Golgotha reveal about Mary is not that she was superhuman in her grief. It is that she was entirely human in her faithfulness. She did not have the resurrection yet. She did not stand at that cross knowing how the story ended. She stood there knowing only what she could see. Her son, dying, in pain, having been abandoned by most of the people who had followed him. She stood there as a mother. And she stayed because staying was, for her, the only form of love that the moment allowed. The sword had been promised. She had not run from the promise. She had walked toward it on foot, through a city, up a hill, and she had remained until there was nothing left to remain for. If you have ever stayed in a room where staying cost you everything, where the only thing keeping you upright was the refusal to let someone die alone, you are standing. In that moment, somewhere very close to where she stood, not in her faith, necessarily, in her love, in the specific, ordinary, devastating kind of love that does not ask to be seen, that simply stays. If this changed how you picture her at the cross, there are more stories like it waiting for you here.